I see in England and Europe, but in England too, in Great Britain, such apprehension about that, such refusal to note the greatness of your country and its contributions. I mean, no one in the United States ever talks about the fact that the UK was the country that eradicated slavery. That only happened once in the whole history of the human race. And your country did it. It took 175 years, and a huge economic, yeah. No, it was your country and the great people who were spearheading that movement at the time that established once and for all, on the political and economic front, that was not to be tolerated. And then, it took a while for that idea to spread everywhere. It still hasn't.
So I recently came across a video featuring Dr. Peterson. He's a clinical psychologist out of Canada, and in this video he's being interviewed by his wife, and he's being asked about his perspective on the passing of the Queen of Britain, Elizabeth II. And during this interview, while paying tribute to her, he lauds or compliments the British government for its role in abolishing slavery. And he also encourages the British citizenry to essentially pat its government on the back for doing away with such a reprehensible institution. And he pedestalizes Britain as a sort of beacon of light on a hill that he feels as though inspired other nations to do away with slavery later. And as I'm listening to this, I found myself being filled with anger because I found it, perverse to compliment a nation or a nation's government that is responsible for such heinous crimes against humanity and the perpetration of chattel slavery, which entailed treating human beings like nothing more than this cell phone. When I use this cell phone and drop on the floor or engage in all of its applications, I never think about how the cell phone feels, and because it's not a sentient being, it's an object without feelings, and that's what chattel slavery entails. It treats people as if they're less than human, and in some cases less than animals. So it feels wrong to compliment a government on abolishing an institution that should have never been erected in the first place. And what Peterson fails to mention is that after abolishing slavery in the 1830s, the British government doles out reparations. But the reparations are not given to the enslaved. The reparations end up going to the enslavers. And the British government takes out a hefty loan of 20 million pounds, and they distribute that money to not only the enslavers but their descendants for the loss of their human property. And so that doesn't sound like moral virtue to me. And and to pay the enslavers and their descendants for the loss of profits that resulted as a consequence of losing their human property, that's more or less tantamount to ending the Holocaust and paying Nazis. Just to put that in perspective, I'll say it again. Paying the enslavers and their descendants, as opposed to the enslaved, is tantamount to ending the Holocaust and paying Nazis and their descendants. The gall to compliment a nation or its government for such an act is just wrong. And this is one of many social issues that I think Peterson gets wrong. Unfortunately, he's not the only person who feels this way and intends to sanitize history, and it's one of the reasons why Malcolm X once said that there are people, including, let's say, a subset of white people in particular, who have become really skilled at using what he called pretty talk, and that means that one can talk about really terrible events and their consequences in a way that seem palatable because one isn't really thinking through or considering the severity of the impact of such events. And I think Peterson has to be called to account on that. So in this next video, I will show an interview where an author and journalist named Douglas Murray is being interviewed, and his response is similar to Peterson's. So you'll find that coming up soon.
No, and it's not just the hate. As you said, it's the historical ignorance, which is astonishing, particularly when it comes from people you'd think would have a grasp of history. They're academics, they're members of the media, the working media. You mentioned some of the other outlets, CNN, The View on the ABC. Let's just have a look at some of these examples.
You know, this idea of how the royal family, how this family grapples with its history and legacy of colonialism, of slavery, of the potential paying of reparations is a really important one. And I think that King Charles understands that his job is, yes, as a monarch, but he is also an anchor for this Commonwealth.
She said, a thieving, raping, genocidal empire is finally dying. May her pain be excruciating.
It was a thieving, raping, genocidal
but I think
empire.
I'm lost for words. Step in.
First of all, if the British Empire had been genocidal, the people in question wouldn't be alive. They wouldn't be speaking. If the British Empire had been a genocidal empire, it would have tried to kill all of the people under its rule. It did no such thing. There wouldn't be any people in the countries that were under British rule if the British Empire had been genocidal. Genocidal is the intent to wipe out an entire people. The British Empire never tried to do that anywhere. That's the first thing. The second thing is that absolute moron we just saw first from CNN talking about reparations. She has no idea in her own racist hatred that Britain paid reparations 250 years ago. We paid reparations throughout the 19th century. We paid reparations for slavery by abolishing it under George III and then policing the high seas to ensure that slavery not only was outlawed across the British territories, but was outlawed across the high seas. We paid higher goods in Britain throughout the 19th century, higher prices in goods, because because we wouldn't deal in enslaving countries such as the United States of America. And so when people talk about reparations today, it demonstrates not just their own basically give me cash mentality, which is all that you see here, but also the incredible ignorance. They don't know that Britain paid down any moral and financial debt it ever had 200 years ago under very distant predecessors of Queen Elizabeth II. And these people are not just tin-rattling money makers. They're also just constantly showing their unbelievable ignorance of everything that happened before the day they were born.
So as you can see here, Murray believes that Britain's, let's say, collective conscience has been wiped clean. He believes that reparations have already been paid out, and curiously, he refers to reparations as the abolishment of slavery and the policing of the high seas to ensure that other nations are engaged in enslavement practices and foregoing the trade of goods with other countries that are engaged in slavery at the time. And quite frankly, that is not reparations. So, he accuses people on the political left of needing a history lesson, but he needs a lesson in what reparations actually is. And what he described is by no means reparative justice for the people who were enslaved or the descendants of such slaves. And what he fails to mention is that what I described earlier, it was the enslavers and their descendants who were granted reparations, essentially. And he's accusing people for wanting handouts, but it is people who enslaved and their descendants who were given handouts because they're benefiting from people who actually worked. And so what he's illustrating here is what's common amongst people like him is he's engaging in a great deal of projection, and he is a prime example of what a psychiatrist named Frances Cress Welsing once described in her article titled "The Cress Theory of Color and Confrontation," and she says, quote, "Yet another psychological defense maneuver utilized by whites has been that of projection. Feeling extreme hostility and hate towards non-whites, the whites began the pattern of stating that non-whites or people with color hated them. In many instances, this mechanism has served to mitigate the guilt whites occasionally feel for constantly feeling the need to aggress against blacks and other non-white peoples." End quote. So, in this video, when he's accusing the news anchor Zane Asher of being racist or essentially calling out racism, it's just a form of projection, and he's projecting his guilt onto black people in order to help maintain his own self-esteem as a white person, a person who is clearly a beneficiary of the atrocities of the past that the British government perpetrated. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and this idea that people of color, or black people in particular, are racist against white people is a farce. It's a lie. It's a canard. It's a false story. And the fact of the matter is, most people of color, or black people in particular, don't hate white people. They hate the ideology of white supremacy, which declares that white people are superior to every other group, especially black people. And the fact of the matter is, racism is synonymous with white supremacy. And it is indeed white people who many centuries ago stratified people groups based upon skin color and assigned power and advantage to those who had the least melanin in their skin and are now referred to as white people, and assigned the least amount of power and a great deal of stigma and disadvantage to people of color and black people in particular. And there's a pithy adage that illustrates how racial groups have been stratified over time, and it goes something like, if you're white, you're right; if you're brown, stick around; if you're yellow, you're mellow; and if you're black, get back. And white people can clearly practice the ideology of white supremacy, but non-whites can practice it as well. And you see this with the phenomenon of colorism, for example. So the closer you are to white, even if you are African or Asian, the lighter your skin is, oftentimes the more advantage you have because of your light skin. And these things are all being wrapped around, are all being born out of the practice of slavery, and the enslavement of people of color and black people in particular by white people. And the British government is among the worst offenders. So I thought I'd create this video in order to present you with the truth, given how many lies are out there. And I thank you for listening. I'm Dr. Thomas. This is my YouTube channel, Jehudi. And thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.